Better dead than red was the Cold War anti-communist slogan. It might also be the anti-socialist rallying cry of one man in the Oval Office, his party and even Democrats worried about what could be going on in the United States. Away from the polarized right wing of Trump, there is something happening to the far, far left. You're watching Roundtable. I'm David Foster. In the United States, they are just a couple of months away from the midterm elections, and there's talk that Republicans are in danger of losing seats. Is the country shifting away from capitalism towards socialism? Of the major democracies, the US stands alone in lacking a strong left-wing tradition. But after the financial crisis rocked the world a decade ago, the American left has consolidated. Recent polls show Democrats and millennials now have a more positive view of socialism than they do of capitalism. But is this a shift to the left, or are we seeing a push to the extremes on both the left and the right? June 2018 in New York City, and Alexandria Ocasio-cortez lands a stunning electoral win. The young left-wing activist managed to unseat one of the country's top Democrats in a congressional primary. Voters liked her stances on a living wage, free college tuition, and universal health care.
My name is Alexandria Ocasio-cortez.
Ocasio-cortez is said to be the youngest ever woman elected to Congress in this November's midterms. Her win surprised Democrats. It scared Republicans. They compared her to Venezuela's hard-left leader Nicolas Maduro. The Republican National Committee said Ocasio-cortez was a, quote, mini Maduro, foreboding the future of Democrats, leading the party to the left with nothing more than an unsubstantiated, factually incorrect socialist wish list. Her rise signals a seismic shift in the attitude of younger Americans to socialism. A recent Harvard survey shows that a majority, 51%, of young adults aged between 18 and 29 reject capitalism.
Take the streets! Take the streets!
This shift was accelerated by the Occupy Wall Street movement. It formed in 2011 in the wake of the global financial crisis. It led to massive bailouts of private banks, but the socialization of their debts. At the same time, Western governments imposed stinging austerity on their peoples. Younger Americans now face a bleak and insecure economic future compared to previous generations. And unlike Europeans, Americans face enormous student debt and often dizzying medical bills.
Our revolution continues!
Discontent with this system was one of the main drivers behind Bernie Sanders' insurgency in 2016. He ultimately lost out on the Democrat nomination to Hillary Clinton, but his influence persists. So change is in the air ahead of the midterm elections this autumn. But is Ocasio-cortez just an outlier from New York or part of a wider trend? And is the US just too different from Europe to foster a genuine social democracy on its soil? Okay, time for us to get going to start the chat, and I can say I'm very pleased to say that joining us on Skype from Washington, D.C. we have David Smith, the Guardian's Washington correspondent. It's early there, even earlier in Los Angeles, where we welcome Mimi Soltysik, the 2016 nominee for the US Socialist Party. Here in the studio, Mark Goyder, founder of Tomorrow's Company, a not-for-profit think tank, and John Rees, author and socialist activist. Thank you very much indeed, each one of you. Mimi, let me come to you first of all. As a socialist candidate, tell me what socialism means to you, and then we can broaden the discussion.
I think at its core, socialist means worker ownership and control over the means of production. Everything starts there. And then, we expand to community control and political democracy, people having control over the institutions that most directly affect their lives.
But that's almost going back to the Marx-Engels definition. State ownership means of production until the state withers away. That's not likely these days, is it?
Well, I'd hesitate to say that anything is unlikely. You know, just a few years ago, the idea that somebody like Donald Trump could be president of the United States, I would have said that's unlikely. So I think people are capable of a lot of things, and why not socialism?
Okay, Mimi. David nodded when you said that about Trump. So did Mark in the studio here. I couldn't see what John was doing. So the hitherto unthinkable, as we say with Trump, could be the hitherto unthinkable when it comes to socialism. Is that possible in the US?
Well, I think we are watching a very marked process of polarization politically. I mean, you raised that question in the introduction. I think that's definitely what's happening. If you look in Europe, who would have thought, and this happened this weekend, that you would see a mass demonstration of fascists giving the Hitler salute in a German city in the post-war world? That's pretty hard to imagine. Pretty hard to imagine an anti-Semitic president of an East European country, but that's happened. Pretty difficult to imagine Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn, but that's happened. So I think what's happening really is that the old rules of politics are breaking down, and in some of the ways they're breaking down are frightening, and some of the ways in which they're breaking down are very, very hopeful, I think. And it's a battle between hope and fear now.
Is this because, as we said or speculated in the report there, that younger people, 51%, I think, don't trust capitalism. They've got an insecure future. Let me put that on to you, Mark.
I think capitalism has forfeited trust. I think it's very interesting to look at the trust monitor that Edelman do every year. The superficial things are things like, well, nobody trusts business people, nobody trusts journalists, nobody trusts politicians. Actually, the significant conclusion that Edelman draw from all of this is there is something about the system that people think isn't working. But I think what you've got to overlay onto that before we're too simple about saying sort of socialism coming back is the labour market is a very different place to what it was, and it's going to be an even more different place in the future. So when Mimi talks about workers taking ownership, I mean, who are these workers? Very interestingly, the amount of Americans who are unemployed has gone up, and the amount of Americans who are unemployed for more than a year has gone up. The amount of people who are employed in full-time jobs is going down. They're more likely to be service jobs. They're more likely to be women. So I think we have protest against a system that I think is widely viewed as illegitimate and lacking moral foundations. The question is, what is going to take its place? And the answer that the workers control things is not an answer.
Okay, David, you were nodding your head earlier on, so you can jump in about Trump and the unthinkable in this. But I want you to give me the wider picture after that, if you would, which is what you think, as a professional observer in the United States, is happening there.
Sure. I mean, yes, I think all bets are off in terms of Trump was utterly unpredictable, and it should not be forgotten how Bernie Sanders was actually pretty close to winning that election if a few things had gone differently. And some say that in a head-to-head of Trump versus Sanders might have won, and quite possibly for a lot of the reasons we're talking about. Are, many would argue Trump and Sanders had the same diagnosis, just very different solutions, and that was obviously great dissatisfaction with trade and international trade deals, and a sense that worker pay was stagnating, and in particular this notion, particularly on the Sanders side for younger people, that the next generation is going to be worse off than their parents, something that in America perhaps had never happened before. So I think that's driving a lot of this for young people, actually, and it's pretty similar to what we see in the UK with Jeremy Corbyn and Labour. There is a reawakening of a desire for state intervention on everything from college education, which is now outrageously expensive and affordable for many, through to healthcare, suddenly single-payer healthcare, something that vaguely begins to resemble the NHS in Britain, although a long way to go, is much more resonant. Also, and I think two factors there also worth mentioning. One, as you say, the financial crisis, the sense that big banks got off scot-free, whereas ordinary people were made to pay the price. And then even more generally than that, memories, I think, Soviet Union and the Cold War have faded. And even when I was growing up, it appeared at least that communism and socialism were such taboo words in the US. They were sort of laughably untouchable.
Well, I was going to say to you, you know, when I lived and worked in the United States, you'd probably rather admit to being a bank robber than to being a socialist. And there's this lovely line in The Guardian this week that says, here's a game to play, a fun game with right-leaning Americans. Say the word socialism and count the number of seconds it takes for them to scream Venezuela. Those days have gone, haven't they?
Well, it depends who you're talking to, and I think one thing one must be wary of in this entire debate is that over on Fox News and the conservative networks that cheer for Trump, they of course are absolutely delighted by talk of a resurgence in socialism because it does play into many of those old tropes, and yes, absolutely, Venezuela is the first thing they reach for to mop aspiring socialists in the US. But yes, you know, that apart, I think socialism has many different meanings to many different people, and there are still some out there who are trying to defend Venezuela and Cuba and get into those arguments. But there are others for whom it is more about bread and butter issues of education and healthcare and so on.
The fun of this program, those of you who've been on before, is that I don't have to do very much work. And Mark, you want to ask a question?
Yeah.
You want to make a point?
This is really for Mimi. I notice in the democratic, in the socialist agenda, is this commitment to guaranteed jobs. I'd like to ask, well, where are those jobs going to come from? I can't see any political party having credibility which doesn't have a clear theory of wealth creation. Where is the wealth going to create? Where are the entrepreneurs going to be encouraged to come forward? Once we've got the entrepreneurs going and we have businesses started, I think we'd all agree we don't want them to end up doing IPOs and on the listed market where short-term shareholders benefit and society gets lost. But we do need entrepreneurs, and I don't see entrepreneurs in the Socialist Manifesto, and I think I'd like to know where you think we're going to get the jobs from.
Mimi, you.
So you make an assumption that that socialists aren't capable of innovation, and I'd like to know where you think that comes from.
So I'm sure socialists are capable of innovation, but I don't think that's the point. I'm saying that we need those aspects of the market economy which enable us to generate businesses which are innovative and which are capable of growing and which are capable of providing employment, solving medical problems, housing problems, and so on.
But the problem is,
John,
the assumption is that businesses are innovative. Actually, businesses are profoundly conservative and often outright reactionary. Look at the United States, where the public transport system, when it was introduced in Los Angeles, was destroyed by the car companies in order to sustain their market. Look at the production of electric light bulbs, which could have been everlasting from the beginning, but were only produced so that they ran out of life, so that they would have to be replaced to sustain a market. So it's not true. It's not remotely true. If we look at the environment, it's not remotely true that what private capitalism does is either innovate or sustain a society which can provide for the mass of people.
You both made a point rather than ask a question.
So what we're saying here, and why there's such distrust in capitalism, is it has proved itself to be a destructive system for the majority of people on the planet. That's the critique, and that's why it's got resonance.
Can I just put that to one side for the moment? And I'm going to go back to Mimi. David in Washington mentioned the fact that the right-wing anchors on Fox News or wherever it was would be loving the fact that Venezuela socialism is being shouted from the rooftops once again for whatever reason. So I'm going to be one of those anchors for just a moment and say to you, Mimi, tell me, where has state intervention worked? Show me a successful socialist society.
I'd ask you, where have you seen a successful capitalist society? And I think historically...
And I'd interrupt and say that wasn't the question.
Okay, that's fine. Where we've seen efforts towards socialism historically, we've also seen attacks from the United States, from capitalist countries. We haven't been able to see an effort made towards socialism that hasn't seen intervention from the West. So let's give
So
that
the
a
answer
shot.
is you can't provide an example.
I think what we're talking about here, look, I live in the United States, right? I live in a country that's intervened whenever there's been an effort to move towards socialism. So what I'd ask is, living in this country, is let's stop that, okay?
Just to add to that, I think what you heard Bernie Sanders talk about during his presidential campaign, and we'll hear other candidates talk about, is it's not necessarily building a new Cuba or Venezuela, but for a start, let's look at government-provided healthcare in countries such as Sweden and Denmark and others. And we've reached a stage where American healthcare provision is in such crisis, accelerated by Donald Trump, that there's a great yearning to say, why are we the only industrialized nation in the world that cannot look after its least healthy, most needful citizens? And they look around the rest of the world to actually democratic capital societies, but that at least have that safety net.
We do have a problem also, actually, with the social democratic countries. We have a problem that actually in democracies, there's at the moment an unwillingness for people to vote for taxes to rise. After the Second World War, fantastic idealism, homes for heroes, we must do the right thing. As we get used to a higher standard of living and higher benefits from society, we tend to take them for granted. And this is a real, I think, historic problem about democracies. But I think that the real opportunity for political parties who want to radicalize things is to tackle the issue of ownership, but to get further than slogans like workers' control, and to get into things like, how can we create a stage of ownership of companies, and this is something Tomorrow's Company talks about a lot, where there can be a sharing of the benefits, whether we're talking about mutuals, whether we're talking about employee ownership, whether we're talking about social enterprise, whether we're talking about pension funds who are really good stewards, whether we're talking about impact investment. I wish the politicians who want to be radical would get into the ownership agenda, because I don't think we're going to change the nature of the societies without changing in a very imaginative way, in a diverse way, the way companies are owned and led.
Well, I mean, two points, really. I mean, firstly, that model of ownership, the sort of social model of ownership, that is at least as long a story historically as socialism, and it has as many failures to it. Robert Owen and the utopian socialists that Marx criticised in the 19th century were actually failures. So there's no one set of ideas here which can say, oh, yes, we got it right historically. But I do want us to talk about the long view here, because it's important. When we're talking about a transformation of the entire economic and social system, we're talking about a world significant event. Like the move from parliamentary democracy, from feudalism and aristocracy to parliamentary democracy. Now look how long that took. Those ideas were first raised in this country in the 17th century, and they weren't common in the world until the 20th century and the middle of the 20th century at that. So when you say, look, these people have tried this, they've tried socialism, it hasn't worked yet, there have been these failures, yeah, fair enough. But there were at least as many failures in trying to establish parliamentary democracy.
So your suggestion is that
it's the long struggle. Yeah.
And it's a battle to be fought. I mean, it's a war to be fought, not just one battle.
Exactly.
And it will go on for a very long time.
Yeah,
so
as long as the problems that produce the movement in the first place exist, and they do exist.
Is that your view? It's evolution, not revolution? Mimi?
No, it is revolution. I mean, the ultimate goal is revolution, but we're also this is going to be a multi-generational effort, as was just said. And I think so often, the questions coming from the right are, where are your victories now? Where are your victories now? And we see victories every day. There are organizing efforts every day. They do make progress, but this is a multi-generational effort.
David, do we have to have a far right? Do we have to have a far left? Is society that polarized in the United States now that there is no room for a reasonable middle ground?
I think the middle ground is still there. It certainly makes a lot less noise than either wing, and there has been a terrific polarization in recent years, as we've seen the rise of Trump. I think one of the fascinating things to watch now is whether socialism in America can find a vehicle, and the obvious one is the Democratic Party, but is the Democratic Party ready for it, or are there too many centrists still in there? And last night, for example, in Florida, a left-wing progressive candidate won a primary there in the governor's race. As you mentioned, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez could be a sign of things to come, but in other parts of the US, Democrats have to play much more in the middle ground, much more moderate. And the nightmare scenario conjured by some people is that in the 2020 presidential election, Democrats do race to the left. That's where all the energy and enthusiasm is and everything we've been talking about. But actually, the numbers are just not there across the country, and it actually plays into the Republican hands.
Quick thought, Mimi, because we haven't got too much longer, but you're sort of shaking your head.
Well, the first thing, right now, when we look at like anthropogenic climate change, we don't, the evidence is rather clear that the planet can no longer handle capitalism, which is a system based on accumulation. The planet can't handle it. So these kinds of discussions, long term, it makes no difference. We either transition, there's no longer a planet capable of hosting life. Secondly, the Democratic Party cannot be a party of socialism. It's a party whose primary reason for existence is to serve capital. When we talk about candidates like Ocasio-cortez, Bernie Sanders, they put forward more of a social democratic, kind of a progressive democratic vision, the stronger social safety net.
Yeah.
We talk about socialism, we're talking about that fundamental, that radical change. We're not looking for a kinder, gentler oppression, a kinder, gentler racism, sexism, etc. We're looking for the abolition of the class-based system.
Okay, can I bring it back to the studio and say that whether we're talking about far-right regimes, whether we're talking about far-left regimes, we're talking about totalitarianism of one sort or the other. And we've seen the result of that when these people or government or systems get hold of power. There is a move back towards the centre, which has been preceded by terrible, terrible loss of life in a lot of cases. So isn't that where we should be looking, at the centre, not at the far left or the far right, and say, look, harmony is what we want, and this isn't going to create harmony?
Well, there's a huge debate about whether some of the societies that you've talked about are actually socialist, and there were always socialists who said they weren't. So that's But
I'm also talking about fascist societies as
well.
I'm talking about totalitarian.
Yeah, and the totalitarian model was one which sought to confuse left and right forms of dictatorship, and I think that's usually a mistake. But I think the problem here is that the centre keeps facilitating the rise of the right. Now, you've got an example of it right here in this country. I was one of the organisers of the protest against Donald Trump when he came to this country. But Donald Trump had the red carpet rolled out for him in this country by the political establishment, including the centre. They said you shouldn't protest. No, 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 he's the head of a state. You've got to treat him with respect. You shouldn't fly this baby balloon of him over London.
Well, he's a grumpy, powerful man, and so you don't want to upset him.
And that's where dictatorship starts. Dictatorship starts when the centre starts excusing the far right.
So where are we going?
I think it's very important for democracy to reassert its legitimacy. And actually, I think a key word here is connectedness. People need to feel connected with the capitalist system. It's no good simply saying, oh, we can do without markets, we can do without capitalism. Nobody's shown how that will work. I think devolution is very important. I think if people could see the money that goes from their pensions going into improving housing, improving roads, or improving schools in their very area, they'd feel differently about it. If people could feel that we weren't in the UK or in such a London-centric country where there's a huge gulf in experience, in poverty, in deprivation between the area outside the southeast and the rest of the country, I think that would make a difference. And also I believe that there's going to have to be a way in which people have the opportunity to participate in solving problems. Many people, this may sound like a really retro idea, many people still go back to a time when they had the experience of doing some kind of
national service and saying, I actually got mixed up with people I would never otherwise have met, and I understood how life was lived outside my own environment. I think a form of what was in America the Peace Corps.
And should that be part of the capitalist view? If
whether
you own a successful business, you've got to give back to the community, not just pay taxes. If you do.
As many of the best businesses do already, that voluntarily, that absolutely should be the case. Okay. I also think that companies who are listed companies should be required to set aside a proportion of their profits.
It is a bit of this
into employee
and
ownership.
That. It's a minestrone, in other words. You know, you take a bit of this, you take a bit of that, all the good ingredients from all the different ideas and recipes, put them all together, and you come up with something which is absolutely perfect.
Nothing is perfect. I think we need to manage people's expectations, but you could do a lot worse than minestrone.
Okay. Mimi in California, we thank you for joining us here. David Smith to report on the fascinating times in the United States. We thank you and hope to have you back on the program another time. From me and my guests, thank you very much for watching Roundtable. We do hope you'll tune in on another occasion, but for now it's time to say goodbye.